More positively, the vaccination programme continues to make very good progress. I can confirm that 4,331,574 people have received the first dose and 3,930,317 have now had both doses. In total, 88% of all those over 18 are now fully vaccinated with 2 doses. In addition, 76% of 16 and 17-year-olds and 56% of 12 to 15-year-olds have had a first dose. Until now, of course, only a single dose has been recommended for these age groups, but following yesterday's updated advice from the JCVI, we're now preparing to offer second doses to 16 and 17-year-olds. I will say a bit more about the progress of the booster programme later.
Booster programme. Well, it's been a while since I've made a video where I've actually spoken into the microphone. And admittedly, this wasn't exactly the first video I wanted to make when I came back. It's just I stumbled across this earlier on while I was scrolling through the Scottish Parliament's YouTube channel. And of course, we're not even a week removed from COP when he was Nicola Thinlips with a brand new fucking shit hairstyle. Fresh from COP. COP's over, now COVID's back. But there's something in particular that I want to touch upon within this hour-long video, which I'll get onto in just a moment. But it's taking a step back for a second and listening to what she's just come away with and said, or claimed anyway, that apparently 88% of people in Scotland have had at least 1 dose of the vaccine. Surely then, by this logic, we should be heading towards easing restrictions, no? If the vast majority of people in the country are vaccinated, I don't understand how COVID could still be an issue. If the vaccines are as pristine and work as well as they proclaim they do. But of course, they don't work as well as these people proclaim that they do. Which begs the question, what's the fucking point in pushing so hard for us all to get it? Because it's not enough that 88% have it. It won't be enough when 89% have it, or 90 or 95. No, because it has to be 100%. And then, at this point, how can you even call somebody that's had both doses fully vaccinated? Because now everybody's been coerced into getting boosters. And because everybody is getting vaccinated at different times, and you have to wait 6 months for a booster after you've had your second dose, by the time people are getting their second dose, people will be waiting months for their second dose, etc. So we will still be in a perpetual cycle of this race against the virus. It's never ending. And if you subject yourself to a vaccine, be my fucking guest at this point, I'm past caring. But you just enter into that loop where you go round and round and round and round and round. It will never ever end. And it's not meant to end. Because one thing has become abundantly clear from my perspective anyway, and that is that COVID has always been the precursor to the climate transformation of society. Hence the constant talk of a sustainable recovery, a green recovery, transformative change. You've heard it all before. They have to keep this bullshit going for as long as possible. They have to keep you in this perpetual cycle. But it just baffles me, the shit that she spews every time she takes to the fucking podium with her written scripts from the civil servants. Ugh, but she's even more insufferable now that she's fresh off the back of COP. There's a new waft of confidence oozing out of her. I don't know why with that shit haircut, but anyway.
However, it is worth pointing out that on first, second and booster and third doses, Scotland is currently the most vaccinated part of the UK. That is down, of course, to the incredible hard work of everyone involved in organising and delivering the programme, and I want to record my thanks to each and every one of them. Today's weekly update, of course, coincides with the latest 3-week review point for the remaining COVID regulations, and so I can confirm that at our meeting earlier today, the Cabinet agreed to keep the current regulations in place with no immediate changes. However, we also considered, though we have not yet reached final decisions, the possibility of future changes to the COVID certification scheme, and I will say more about that shortly as well.
Yeah. The COVID certificate scheme, the COVID vaccine passports, etc. You might think that she's going to tell the public here in this announcement that they're going to be pulled back. There's no need for them anymore. Oh, no. There's talk of expanding them now. What a shock.
More generally across Scotland, we have seen a gradual increase in cases over the past 2 weeks, from just over 2,500 new cases a day to approximately 3,000 cases a day at this stage. It is important to note, though, that this headline figure masks some distinct variation between different age groups. For example, cases amongst under 60s increased by 14% during the past week, and much of this increase was in people under the age of 20. By contrast...
Oh, under the age of 20 is where the vast majority of the cases are starting to emerge. And what did she announce that I played at the beginning of the video? That they are now going to be following up on the recommendations to give 16 and 17-year-olds their second dose, because it's now been recommended. And this is the second time to my recollection that the SNP have done this. If I'm not mistaken, around about the time they were talking about vaccinating the under 18s, or it might have been the under 24s, it was a young demographic anyway. We're going back months here. They were debating whether or not to implement or to make this a recommendation for the Scottish Government to then act upon. And wouldn't you know, simultaneously as this was being talked about, cases started to rise in that specific age group, almost as if it was the precursor to set a bit of panic into that said demographic. So when the recommendation was put forth and acted upon, the people in the aforementioned recommendation demographic would pounce on the opportunity to be vaccinated. That's what that screams out to me, but that's here nor there. Anyway.
Contrast, cases in the over 60 age group fell over the past week by 11%. Now, this is likely to be due, at least in part, to the success of the booster programme, which of course is prioritised amongst the older population, and I'll say more about that shortly. The decline in cases amongst older people may also explain why, despite the overall increase in cases, the numbers in hospital with COVID have reduced slightly in recent weeks. 3 weeks ago, 917 patients were in hospital with COVID. Today there are 779, and the number in intensive care has also fallen, although very slightly during that time, from 59 to 57. Presiding Officer, the final mitigation measure I want to talk about today is the COVID certification scheme. It is the strong view of the Scottish Government that this, together with the other measures still in place, makes an important and proportionate contribution to stemming COVID transmission. The value of certification is also recognised in other countries, many of which require certification for access to a much wider range of services than is currently the case in Scotland.
It's funny how Nicola Sturgeon always seems to do this when she justifies the COVID vaccine passport scheme, or the certification scheme, sorry. She insists on using other countries as examples, saying that other countries do it, X, Y and Z do it, as if to give off the impression that she's not doing anything irrational because other countries are doing it. That should be ringing alarm bells to people that multiple countries across Europe especially, but not just limited to Europe, are implementing the exact same fucking policies, such as vaccine passports. Just because some countries are a bit more stringent with where you can and cannot go if you can't provide proof, that's irrelevant. The fact of the matter is that multiple countries have implemented the identical policy. And then again, when you take a step back, as these people know themselves, this vaccine that they love to promote all the time doesn't stop you getting the big bad coof, doesn't stop you passing on the coof. Therefore, the vaccine passports as a concept are worse than useless. Fucking useless. Because you could quite easily be jib-jabbed, but then still walk into a premises, and pollute everyone. So I would really like an explanation at this point from the likes of this baboon as to why we are implementing these things, or extending them even. It flies in the face of fucking reality. Well, it would if it wasn't for that, of course. We all know it's nothing to do with protecting people's health.
The value of certification is also recognised in other countries, many of which require certification for access to a much wider range of services than is currently the case in Scotland. Wales, for example, expanded the scope of its own scheme yesterday. It now applies to theatres, cinemas and concert halls in addition.
Which is exactly what she intends to extend it to. She can't even come up with her own ideas in the case of the UK. She's just copying Drakeford. Again, makes you wonder, makes you think why they're all doing the same fucking thing.
To the same range of venues as in Scotland. The Cabinet discussed possible changes to the current certification scheme at our meeting this morning. We intend to take a final decision next Tuesday in light of the most up-to-date data. In the meantime, later this week, we will publish an evidence paper and consult businesses on the practicalities of implementation should any changes be made. However, while final decisions have not yet been reached, I want to provide an update on the issues under consideration. I should also say that we would provisionally intend for any changes we do decide to make to the scheme to take effect from December the 6th. When the scheme launched on 1 October, we judged that it was not appropriate at that time, given the imperative to drive up vaccination rates, to include testing as an alternative to proof of vaccination, but we indicated this would be kept under review. So we will be assessing in the coming days whether, on the basis of current and projected vaccination uptake rates, we are now in a position to amend the scheme so that, in addition to showing evidence of vaccination to access a venue, there will also be the option of providing evidence of a recent negative test result. That is already a feature, of course, of many other countries' certification schemes. We are also considering whether an expansion of the scheme to cover more settings would be justified and prudent, given the current state of the pandemic. Again, let me stress that we have not at this stage taken a decision to extend the reach of the scheme. However, to allow us to engage openly with businesses in the coming days about the pros, cons and practicalities, I can confirm that the kinds of settings that might be in scope would be indoor cinemas, theatres and some other licensed and hospitality premises.
So exactly the same as fucking Wales.
We would, of course, retain exemptions for those under 18, for those who cannot be vaccinated or tested for medical reasons, for people on clinical trials and for those who work at events or in venues subject to the scheme. Exceptions would also be retained for worship, weddings, funerals and related gatherings. I will give a further update on this in next week's statement, and if we decide to propose any amendments to the regulations on certification, Parliament will have the opportunity to discuss and debate these amendments. Presiding Officer, I am acutely aware that many businesses want us to remove mitigations, including certification, not extend or tighten them. I understand that, but all of our decisions are and must be motivated by a desire to keep people safe, but also to get through what will be a challenging winter without having to reintroduce any restrictions on trade. We want, if possible, businesses to stay fully open over Christmas and through the winter, while also keeping COVID under control. If an expansion of COVID certification can help us do that, it would be irresponsible not to consider it.
Interesting. As you'll come to find just a little later on. Notice what she said there in her little ramble. She used the word vaccine uptake. See, when the scheme was first introduced, as she referenced there was talk of, alongside vaccine passport proof, you could also provide proof of a negative test. And they declined that idea at the time. But now, because of vaccine uptake, they're quite prepared to consider, alongside proof of vaccination, a negative test. And she gives her explanation several times actually during this, because she does actually receive a relatively small amount of pushback from some of the opposing parties in relation to this scheme. And Sarwar is probably the only one that's been relatively consistent in regards to this. I think the Lib Dems actually were against this at the time when it first was announced several months ago. But Anas Sarwar, I can confidently say, has always been relatively opposed to it. And again, he makes a good point here, and Nicola Sturgeon's explanation really is just... I mean, it begs belief that this thin-lipped bitch talks to no end about human rights, etc., etc. But yet, vaccine mandates, etc., are kind of infringing on human rights. And it's coercive by nature, coercive by her very definition.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to start by offering my condolences to all those that have lost a loved one and to recognise those who continue to put every effort into the front line and keep us all safe. I would urge the Government, though, to do more than just applaud them and thank them, recognise and reward them too when they come forward with their own pay disputes. The Government has still not fixed the tools they already have and are now instead looking at expanding a system that the Deputy First Minister himself said he had no evidence that was reducing cases of COVID. The vaccine works. It reduces hospitalisations, It reduces death rates. It reduces cases of long COVID. But it does not stop you from getting the virus, and it doesn't stop you from spreading the virus.
Exactly.
The First Minister in her statement said that lateral flow testing helped to reduce transmission at COP. She has been arguing the opposite in relation to the vaccine passport scheme. At every point in the process of developing vaccine passports, we have argued the importance of a negative test. In fact, every single scheme that the First Minister quoted in her statement and in her response includes the use of a negative test. So in the coming week, accept you got it wrong, admit that testing should always have been at the heart of our COVID reduction strategy, and commit today to including a negative test in any reformed or expanded scheme, to meaningfully engage with the sectors impacted, to share the evidence, to consider the practicalities and provide a financial packages that stop businesses going under and people losing their jobs.
First Minister.
Firstly, on reward for those who work so hard in our National Health Service, I would dearly love to be in a position to give a higher pay rise than we have, and we will always seek to maximise that. But I do think it's important to put on record that NHS workers in Scotland, Agenda for Change workers, are receiving this year the highest pay increase of any NHS workers in any part of the UK, including where Labour is in government. So perhaps we should judge on what they do, not just on what they say. On the issue of the vaccine certification scheme and the inclusion of a negative test, this is a finely balanced judgment. When we have take a decision to introduce a scheme with the express objective of using that, at least in part, to drive up vaccination rates, it makes no sense to have an alternative to vaccine initially as part of that scheme, because then we...
That's fucking coercion. That is literally coercion. Clear as day. I mean, when I first heard this, I genuinely could not believe that she had the audacity to stand there and say that. I mean, I've seen it quoted from time to time in articles pertaining to the vaccine certification scheme. But to stand there with the brass fucking neck and just openly admit to the world that the whole premise, at least in parts, was to increase vaccine uptake. So you prevented people from being able to enter certain places until they got vaccinated, and that's not coercion. And again, she ignores this point. A point they all fucking ignore when it gets raised is the fact that these vaccine passports, or the vaccines I should say, don't stop you getting it, don't stop you passing it on. Therefore, what is the real point of a vaccine certificate? It's control, fundamentally. That's what it is. But it's control obtained via coercion. What would be the point in having an alternative to a vaccine passport? Fuck, man. Oh, wow. I just can't believe she fucking said that. That is fucking coercion. Wow.
But I do think it's important to put on record that NHS workers in Scotland, Agenda for Change workers, are receiving this year the highest pay increase of any NHS workers in any part of the UK, including where Labour is in government. So perhaps we should judge on what they do, not just on what they say. On the issue of the vaccine certification scheme and the inclusion of a negative test, this is a finely balanced judgment. When we have take a decision to introduce a scheme with the express objective of using that, at least in part, to drive up vaccination rates, it may...
And it's funny as well when she says that, because I don't recall her ever saying that at the time when it was first announced. It was only after the fact that I remember Hamza Yousaf making reference to it a few times in articles. I don't recall anybody saying it in Parliament. I especially don't recall her ever saying it. At least in part, to drive uptake of the vaccine. That is fucking coercion. This horrible little bitch. I can't stand this woman. I don't care if she's a puppet or not. She is fucking evil. I can't stand her. Fucking wow. I mean, wow. And again, though, if it's real, she implied earlier on, I don't know if I played it in this or not, I might have done. It's getting early in the morning, I was going to say late, but it's getting early. She implied it was about, we have to do everything we can, to make things safe. But yeah, the next breath, it's about increasing vaccine uptake. If it was always about keeping people safe, surely a negative test would have done the exact same thing that a vaccine passport would have done. Because as things currently stand, it would suggest, to me anyway, not that I have much faith in these tests, irrespective of whether it's the lateral flow or the other one, it would suggest that if that suggests you're negative, you probably are, as opposed to a vaccine passport, because you could still pass it on, etc.
Makes no sense to have an alternative to vaccine initially as part of that scheme, because then we wouldn't have seen there is perhaps
we wouldn't have seen what? We wouldn't have seen more people getting vaccinated. Wow. Fucking wow. So in the one breath bragging about how Scotland's got so many people vaccinated, how did you manage that? Oh, because you coerced them. Yeah.
an argument here that one of the reasons why we are currently the most vaccinated part of the UK is that, at least in part, our vaccine certification scheme has helped to drive vaccine uptake. Now,
that's fucking coercion. I can't believe, honestly. Wow.
there comes a point where your consideration changes because you make a judgment that we have already got all of the gains of increased vaccine uptake, and therefore we can move to include LFD tests. I understand the importance of LFD tests as part of a package of measures. That's why every week when I stand here, I talk about the importance of them. These are careful judgments to take. We have taken careful judgments up until now.
Oh, is that why you're copying every country that came before you? I mean, pull the other one with his nonsense. She's not done anything that is remotely different to any other country in one way or another.
We will not always get these judgments right, but we will continue to take them responsibly and taking account of all of the evidence. We will, as I said in my statement, publish an evidence paper this week. We will continue to talk to businesses, and we will continue to arrive at these very difficult decisions as carefully as we possibly can. I know that for the opposition here, they want to say that we just need to do nothing, and everything that we put forward is opposed. That is
everything we put forward is opposed. This is a running theme, and not just this video, the climate change one that was in the same day, which was also about an hour long. Every single politician from an opposing party that said anything that could be portrayed as somewhat against what she said, opposed to what she said, immediately she goes into a frenzy, starts to imply that it wouldn't matter what she said or did, they would oppose her. You know, woe is me. This is the same thin-lipped who spent God knows how many years opposing absolutely everything that came out in relation to Brexit. But when the shoe's on the other foot, this feminist fucker does nothing but whinge and moan and complain. At the end of the day, a vaccine mandate, irrespective of whether or not it's stringent, such as in other countries, or if it's relatively mundane for the time being until such a time as you decide to expand it, irrespective, it's a breach of human rights and it's coercion. You are coercing people into getting vaccinated. You are treating them as second-class citizens to some extent until they decide to get vaccinated in order for them to be able to enter certain places. And now there's talk of extending it to more areas. Why? Why would you do that if the vast majority of people have been vaccinated, according to the Scottish Government themselves? And then again, it comes down to the fundamental principle that vaccine passports don't prove a damn fucking thing. They are worse than useless, as I've said. And if we're going to go down that route, I would probably prefer to rely on a test as opposed to proving whether or not I've been jib-jabbed. But hell.
An easy option, but when you're in government, there are no easy options, particularly in the face of a global pandemic.
Fuck off, you.
Presiding officer, if any proof were needed that vaccine certification is unnecessary and there are better alternatives, then it can be found at COP26. The First Minister just said herself that it was the safest possible environment. With using daily LFTs, attendees were 3
I will play her response, but she goes on to talk about all the other things that they allegedly did at COP to ensure that there wasn't a spike in cases. But the thing that he's referring to is the fact that she only actually mentioned at the beginning of the 20, 30 minute, however long it was, no, 20 odd minute speech that she gave at the beginning of the video, she only mentioned lateral flow tests. She didn't mention any of these other things, hence why this individual, as you can see on the screen here, goes on to mention that. You know, it's not exactly a gotcha directed at this guy, but of course Nicola Phillips thinks it is. Oh, well, there's other things that we did actually, so you know. Well, you didn't fucking mention them, did you?
Times less likely to test positive for COVID-19 than the general population where vaccine certification is at large. We know that LFTs are superior to vaccine passports in two significant ways. Firstly, they provide an on-the-day snapshot of your COVID status rather than your vaccine status, which helps venues ascertain who is sick and who is well. And secondly, perhaps most importantly, it prevents the need for you to pass part of your medical history or evidence of recent treatment to somebody who is not your clinician. A mixed bag or a combination of these two schemes will not cut it. So will the First Minister abandon vaccine certification entirely and build a scheme built entirely around lateral flow testing?
No, of course she won't do that. The same way that none of the other countries that have implemented it will do that. Because it's not about health. It's not about stopping COVID. No, it's about coercion. And then that really does bring me into the dangerous territory which could get my channel wiped. It really makes you think, why are they so desperate to coerce you to take it? Because the guy's got a point. Tests are much more beneficial in terms of proving whether or not you have the big bad coof. It tells you there and then, apparently. Not that it's a COVID test anyway, but hey ho, let's just go along with their little narrative for the sake of argument's sake. Whereas you could show a COVID vaccination screenshot or whatever via your phone, your app, etc. But you could still have COVID with no symptoms. Pass it on.
Thank you.
First Minister.
Oh, I won't, because I think my duty to try to keep the population of Scotland as safe as possible means...
It's not keeping them safe, so is it? It's not. Fuck it, I just hate her. I hate her.
Means that I can't just take the easy options that I like Cole Hamilton.
Well, it is an easy option, though, because you're just copying what other countries have done before you. This wasn't a unique idea that Nicola Phillips came up with when she was sitting around her little round table with all the little SNP Rainbow Unicorn delegates. No. This is lockstep, essentially. Countries around the world have implemented the same thing, and she just jumped on the fucking bandwagon. The easy option. I mean, at the end of the day, if it's about public health, then surely, if nothing else, COVID vaccines are relatively, what's the word I should be using? Deceptive. There we go.
Might put forward. And I think he misunderstands the package of mitigations that were in place around COP26, where part of the protections were that delegates were asked to be double vaccinated.
I didn't fucking mention that, though, so that's why he brought that up.
Before they arrived, we offered vaccination to people who were coming from countries where that wasn't available, and then LFD tests, of course, were an additional precaution over and above that. So
well, that's the only thing you mentioned, though. So you know,
it's easy to be selective, but it is.
It's easy to be selective. The only thing she fucking brought up when talking about COP and the lack of a spike in COVID cases as a result of COP was lateral flow tests. So remind me again, who exactly has been selective in this little exchange here? But this thin-lipped power man, narcissist, let's just be polite for the sake of being polite, eh? It's fucking mental. The smirk on her face, she just thinks that she's something relatively higher than her station.
It's perhaps better to look at the whole package of measures that
fucking mention them then, you
were in place. And in terms of the wider issue here, when you have a scheme that is partly about driving up vaccination rates, then it makes no sense to give an alternative to vaccine because then you undermine the objective of your scheme. And it is really important. Vaccines have limitations, although they are hugely effective. LFD tests are effective but also have limitations. We need to use all of these tools at our disposal to drive rates down as far as possible and keep people...
Well, I've not really heard of a vaccine before now. I could be completely mistaken here, but I've not really heard of a vaccine before where you can still contract a virus and still spread it on. And in fact, if we're going to go down that route, how many people, when they always talk about people that are in hospital currently, how many people are in hospital that have had a vaccine or both vaccines? This is information that they deliberately leave out. But yet some damning statistics have come out in the past maybe 4 or 5 months anyway, if I'm not mistaken. From time to time anyway, that would suggest that a lot of the people that are now dying from COVID have actually been double jabbed. Makes you think, not that you know fuck all about that, you wannabe epidemiologist. You're too busy being a climatologist now,
As safe as possible, and that's the obligation and the responsibility that this government will continue to take seriously, even when it means unpopular decisions every single day that we're in this pandemic.
And Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister told Parliament that she would listen to businesses before introducing COVID certification. She didn't. Now she's considering extending it. This morning we learned that 1 in 4 Scottish businesses are facing immediate financial peril if COVID restrictions are expanded. This from a survey conducted of 700 businesses by the Scottish Chambers of Commerce. So will the First Minister confirm that if businesses respond with a resounding no to her creeping plans, as the Scottish Chambers of Commerce already has, calling it a giant step backwards, that she will abandon any extension to the scheme?
First Minister.
We do listen to businesses, and we will continue to listen to businesses, an important voice, but not the only voice. I also have a duty to listen to those working in the front line of our National Health Service who are saying we need to do as much as we can to reduce the risks of COVID transmission. And I need to listen to people across the country who want to be able to go back to pubs and restaurants but feel safer as they do so, particularly when we've got rising rates of transmission, to those who are particularly clinically vulnerable, who also
Probably as well from people that have been vaccinated. Just saying.
Want to feel safe when they're going about their normal life. So one of the difficult things, but I accept it as part of the responsibility of taking decisions as opposed to just deciding on a position and sticking to it, is that we have to take account of
morality, quite frankly. And it's not moral in the slightest to coerce people to be vaccinated. It's not moral to implement vaccine mandates, irrespective of whether or not they are stringent, like in other countries, or are currently mundane for the time being. It's not a case of picking a side and sticking to it. One is right and one is wrong.
and listen to a range of views and come to a balanced, sensible and responsible decision. Businesses are an important voice in that, but actually we have to take account of the wide range of considerations and factors that lead to us taking decisions in what is an inherently difficult and complex set of circumstances.
Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. People have recently expressed their frustration at seeing the Prime Minister with no mask on in a hospital, some who have loved ones in hospital with COVID. Can I ask the First Minister, what is the Scottish Government doing to ensure that people will understand the importance of adhering to guidelines regardless of vaccination status?
This is another thing that's pissing me off about this, and I realise now that this video is a half an hour long, for fuck's sake, is that over a year has passed since this nonsense first started. And not only are we now talking about booster shots, but we're still talking about masks as if they actually work at all. The same way that they still pretend that any of the rules have played any role in reducing the spread of big bad COVID. Because if we're going to go down this route of logic, then surely there shouldn't be a rise in COVID cases currently, irrespective of whether or not you've been vaccinated, because everybody's following the fucking rules and wearing masks. But still, imagine standing there and asking for the First Minister to give you some valid information in relation to what will be done to ensure that the public are swiftly reminded to keep wearing their fucking nappy. Oh.
Regardless of vaccination status, particularly through these winter months.
First Minister.
Well, specifically, we launched yesterday the next phase of our marketing and communication programme to support compliance with the baseline measures that...
Always listen to the words that these people use, whether it's socially just, sustainable, transformative, acceleration, compliance, comply, compliance, comply. It's all about control. Coercive control when it comes to vaccine mandates, but compliance nonetheless.
That are still in place, including wearing face coverings to help reduce the harms caused by COVID. And what I'd say to everybody is that it is really important as we go into winter that all of us just try to increase our compliance. I understand, and all of us slip up from time to time on these things.
The reason for that, if you were to ask me, is because, as I said earlier, they have to keep this going for as long as humanly possible. Now, the best way to do that in theory is to have the vast majority, because not everybody will comply, but the vast majority of the public running around, going for the motions as if there is a pandemic out there. And because they're following all the rules, that's probably why they'll believe that they won't come into contact with anybody that's ill, etc., 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 because they're following the rules like a good little goyim. And it kind of gives off the impression, the belief to these people that are complying, that they're doing the right thing, and it keeps the idea of a virus alive in their fucking head. When in reality, the matter is, it really is, for the most part, in their head.
I understand how tiresome, how inconvenient it is, particularly after so long. But as we go into winter, wearing face coverings, reminding ourselves to do it is really important. And I know I'll be doing that, and I would call on everybody to do likewise. And I also want to take this opportunity again to urge every single person who is eligible for vaccination, whether for a first or second jab, or a booster or third jag, to please take up the offer without delay and get the flu jag too if you are eligible. Getting vaccinated remains the single most important thing any of us can do to protect ourselves, our loved ones and our communities. It is impossible to overstate how important it is to get vaccinated, so if you haven't already, please do so now. You could be saving your own life or the lives of your loved ones. You will be reassuring others, including those most at risk, some of whom have clinical conditions that mean they cannot get vaccinated themselves. You will be helping those working in the NHS, and you will be maximising our collective chances of getting through this winter without the need to reintroduce any restrictions. Presiding Officer, in my view, choosing without good reason not to be vaccinated is deeply irresponsible. Getting vaccinated, on the other hand, is a civic duty, and it is the most precious gift we can give to others at this time.
You can fucking ram it, you thin-lipped baboon.